At 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, the Pacific erupted in fire. Three of Japan's mighty carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning within minutes, their flight decks turned into blazing infernos. It seemed impossible. The same force that had humiliated Pearl Harbor, now crippled in a single strike. Japanese sailors screamed as fuel tanks erupted, planes toppled into the sea, and officers watched helplessly as their floating fortresses were consumed by fire. But this miracle of destruction was not chance. It was the result of a deadly game of code-breaking, deception, and courage that led directly to Midway. The story of Midway begins not on the ocean, but in hidden rooms filled with radio operators and cryptanalysts. In the spring of 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto designed a masterstroke: lure the remaining American carriers into battle by threatening Midway Atoll, a small U.S. outpost northwest of Hawaii. His plan was ambitious. With 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, the Imperial Japanese Navy sought to crush American resistance in one decisive engagement. On paper, it should have worked. Japan still held the initiative after Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines. Their carrier pilots were the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Their fleet was vast, disciplined, and confident. But Yamamoto's plan had a fatal weakness. American intelligence had cracked portions of the Japanese naval code. At Pearl Harbor, Station Haipo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, intercepted and decrypted crucial signals. They identified that AF, the target of the Japanese operation, was Midway. By late May 1942, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz knew exactly where and when the Japanese strike would come. Instead of being surprised, the Americans prepared an ambush. 3 U.S. carriers, USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Hornet, CV-8, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, CV-5, moved into position northeast of Midway. Together they carried more than 360 aircraft: SBD Dauntless dive bombers, TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and F4F Wildcat fighters. Waiting near the island were Marine fighters, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and even B-26 Marauders, all ready to defend Midway. The stage was set. 2 fleets were converging on a tiny speck of land in the Pacific, but only one side understood what was truly coming. Japan believed they were the hunters. In reality, they were sailing directly into a trap. The morning of June 3, 1942, reconnaissance aircraft spotted Japanese ships. At once, Midway's garrison prepared for battle. Air raid sirens echoed across the atoll. Soldiers scrambled to bunkers, and anti-aircraft gunners loaded their weapons. Bombers lifted off the coral runways, heading into uncertain skies. The clash was inevitable. As the sun rose over the Pacific on June 4th, the world was about to witness a transformation of history itself. Within 24 hours, 4 Japanese carriers would lie shattered beneath the waves. But before that could happen, waves of desperate airmen, American and Japanese alike, would risk everything in the skies over Midway. The Pacific sky at dawn was alive with the roar of engines. Japanese bombers, sleek and deadly, swept low over Midway Island, their shadows racing across the lagoon. Anti-aircraft guns thundered in defiance, filling the air with black smoke and fiery bursts. U.S. Marines fired desperately, tracer rounds streaking upward, while men scrambled from their bunks to foxholes. At 6:30 a.m., the first bombs fell, tearing through fuel depots and hangars, engulfing the island in smoke and flame. But unknown to the Japanese, their attack was being watched, tracked, and anticipated. The Americans were not surprised. They were waiting. The morning of June 4, 1942, began with Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launching his first strike against Midway Atoll. From the decks of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, a force of 108 aircraft took off. 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, armed with bombs for this mission, 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters as escort. The flight took more than 2 hours across open water. Below them lay their target: Midway, a small coral atoll armed with runways, a garrison of U.S. Marines, and a handful of aircraft. At 6:30 a.m., Japanese aircraft descended on the island. Dive bombers screamed downward, releasing bombs that smashed into oil tanks and fuel depots. Hangars erupted in fire. Barracks collapsed. The U.S. Marines defending Midway fired their anti-aircraft guns with determination, filling the sky with flak bursts. Though the Japanese caused serious damage, their mission was not decisive. Midway still had functioning runways, and, more importantly, its defenders still had fight left in them. As the Japanese were striking Midway, the Americans responded with everything they had. From the island's coral runways, Marine fighters scrambled into the sky, F-2A Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats. Outnumbered and outclassed by the agile Japanese Zeros, they fought with courage but suffered terrible losses. Nearly half the defending Marine fighters were destroyed in minutes. Then came the bombers, B-26 Marauders and TBF Avengers, freshly delivered torpedo bombers flown straight into combat, charged toward the Japanese fleet. Their attack was reckless, almost suicidal. Of the 6 Avengers launched from Midway, only 1 made it back. The Marauders, too, were torn apart by Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Yet, despite heavy losses, these missions had a purpose: to harass, to distract, and above all, to make the Japanese think that the Americans were desperate and blind. But the Americans were not blind. While Midway-based aircraft struck at the Japanese fleet, U.S. carriers were already in position to launch their own blow. Admiral Chester Nimitz had given his commanders a single order: attack aggressively. By 7 a.m., reports from returning Japanese pilots reached Admiral Nagumo. They declared that Midway had been heavily damaged, but not destroyed. This left him with a critical decision. Should he launch a second strike on Midway? Or should he prepare his reserve planes with torpedoes to counter the possibility of an American fleet? He hesitated. Orders were given, then reversed. Japanese carrier decks became chaotic. Planes were being refueled, rearmed, and moved between hangars. Torpedoes and bombs lay scattered across the decks, fuel hoses stretched across open spaces, and Zeros buzzed overhead in constant combat air patrol. It was in this dangerous moment of confusion that the Americans were closing in. While Nagumo weighed his options, the U.S. carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had already launched their strike groups. Over 150 aircraft were heading straight for the Japanese fleet. The battle was entering its most desperate phase. The Japanese, confident they still had the upper hand, did not yet realize that fate had already turned against them. The U.S. Navy's torpedo squadrons took off in waves that morning, knowing the odds were almost hopeless. Their aircraft were the Douglas TBD Devastators, slow, underarmed, and outdated compared to the sleek Japanese Zeros waiting above the carriers. Yet the men who climbed into those cockpits understood their mission. They had to press home an attack, no matter the cost, to draw Japanese fighters and guns away from the dive bombers still searching for the enemy fleet. From the decks of USS Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, launched 15 Devastators. As they formed up, Waldron knew his squadron was heading into danger unlike anything they had faced. He told his men over the radio, "Just follow me, and I will take you to the enemy. If we do not meet them, the others will. May God be with us all." By 9:20 a.m., VT-8 had found the Japanese fleet. With no fighter escort, they had become separated from their assigned Wildcats. They began their attack run directly into the teeth of Japanese defenses. The Zeros pounced almost instantly. In minutes, the slow Devastators were being shredded. Planes fell one after another into the sea, burning or breaking apart. Not a single torpedo struck home. 14 of the 15 Devastators were destroyed. The sole survivor was Ensign George Gay, who bailed out of his burning aircraft and watched the rest of the battle from the sea. Minutes later, VT-6 from USS Enterprise arrived. 14 more Devastators, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, pressed in against the Japanese carriers. They too faced the same deadly gauntlet. Zeros dove in, ripping apart the formation. 10 of the 14 planes were lost. The rest were forced to drop torpedoes without effect. Lindsay himself was killed in the attack. Finally, VT-3 from USS Yorktown, under Commander Lance Massey, entered the battle. 12 Devastators bore down on the Japanese carriers, escorted by a few Wildcats that fought desperately against waves of Zeros. 10 of the 12 were destroyed, and once again, not a single torpedo found its target. By 10 a.m., the picture was bleak. The U.S. had sacrificed almost the entire torpedo bomber force. Out of 41 Devastators launched by the three carriers, 35 had been destroyed. The cost in men was staggering. To the Japanese, it seemed like victory was certain. Their carrier decks, though crowded with fueled and armed planes, remained untouched. Their Zeros had swept the sky clean of American attackers. Morale was high. But what the Japanese did not realize was that the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had achieved something critical. Their Zeros had been pulled down to sea level, locked in furious dogfights with the slow Devastators. Their attention was fixed below. At higher altitude, unchallenged, a formation of dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown was arriving, unseen. The sacrifice of VT-8, VT-6, and VT-3 bought only minutes of time. But those minutes would prove decisive. History was about to pivot in the space of a single dive. At 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, the most dramatic reversal in naval history unfolded in the skies above the Pacific. After the torpedo squadrons had been wiped out, the Japanese fleet seemed untouchable. Zeros patrolled confidently at low level. Anti-aircraft guns bristled, and on the carrier decks below, fuel hoses snaked between aircraft being hastily rearmed and refueled. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered, waiting to be loaded. It was a scene of frantic preparation and of deadly vulnerability. High above, unseen by the Japanese, U.S. Navy dive bombers had arrived. From USS Enterprise, Scouting Squadron 6, VS-6, under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, and Bombing Squadron 6, VB-6, led by Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, circled into position. From USS Yorktown, Bombing Squadron 3, VB-3, under Max Leslie, joined them. Nearly 40 SBD Dauntless dive bombers were poised to strike, their pilots watching as the enemy fleet maneuvered far below. Luck and skill had guided them here. Earlier that morning, Enterprise's Air Group Commander Wade McCluskey had spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing to rejoin the fleet after chasing away an American submarine. McCluskey decided to follow its trail of wake across the ocean. That instinct brought his squadrons directly over the heart of the Japanese carrier force. The attack began in perfect unison. From altitude, the Dauntlesses rolled over into their dives, plunging almost vertically. The sun glinted off their wings as the pilots roared downward, canopies rattling, dive brakes shrieking. Below, Japanese lookouts shouted warnings, but it was too late. Kaga was the first to be struck. Dive bombers from VS-6 descended in a furious attack. At least 4 bombs slammed into her deck, igniting fuel lines and detonating among armed aircraft. Flames engulfed the ship instantly, sweeping from bow to stern. Explosions tore through hangars filled with torpedoes. Within minutes, the great carrier was mortally wounded. Akagi, the flagship, was targeted next. Richard Best himself led his section into the dive. One of his bombs pierced the flight deck near the midships elevator and exploded in the hangar below. The blast ignited fuel hoses and aircraft stacked with bombs. Although Akagi was hit by only a single bomb, it was catastrophic. The carrier erupted into uncontrollable fire, forcing Admiral Nagumo to abandon his command ship. Soryu was struck almost simultaneously. 3 bombs from Yorktown's VB-3 tore into her deck, triggering violent secondary explosions. Aircraft loaded with torpedoes erupted, and in moments the ship was burning from end to end. Smoke billowed thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were doomed. The ocean below, moments earlier dominated by Japanese power, had transformed into a scene of chaos and destruction. Survivors leapt into the sea to escape the flames, while officers scrambled to save what they could. But there was no saving the ships. By 10:25 a.m., Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were mortally stricken. Their decks were shattered, their hangars infernos, their air groups destroyed. The Japanese fleet, masters of the Pacific only 6 months earlier, now faced disaster beyond imagination. And yet, the battle was not over. One carrier remained. Sōryū, untouched and still fully operational, prepared to strike back. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were blazing wrecks on the morning of June 4, 1942. Yet one remained untouched. Sōryū, under the command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi. While his comrades' ships burned, Yamaguchi refused to retreat. He knew his carrier was now Japan's last hope of salvaging the battle. With calm determination, he ordered 2 waves of counterstrikes against the Americans. At 10:45 a.m., the first strike launched. 18 Aichi-D 3A Val dive bombers, escorted by 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. Their target, USS Yorktown. At this moment, Yorktown's crew did not yet know that their dive bombers had crippled 3 enemy carriers. Instead, radar picked up approaching bogies, and Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered full battle readiness. Fighters of VF-3, flying the rugged Grumman F4F Wildcats, rose to intercept. A savage dogfight unfolded above the fleet, but the Vals broke through. At 12 noon, the Japanese dive bombers pounced. With precision honed at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, they dived on Yorktown. Anti-aircraft gunners filled the sky with black bursts, but it was not enough. 3 bombs slammed into the carrier. One struck the flight deck, ripping open steel plating and igniting fuel. Another penetrated into the engineering spaces, knocking out boilers. Smoke poured from the stricken ship as fires raged below decks. For a moment, Yorktown seemed doomed. But the crew refused to give up. Damage control teams fought furiously. Fire hoses snaked across the deck, pumps roared, and sailors braved smoke-filled compartments to contain the blazes. Within an hour, miraculously, Yorktown was underway again, smoke still trailing but flight operations restored. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria, believing Yorktown too damaged to remain his flagship, but the carrier had survived. Yamaguchi's scouts reported Yorktown still afloat. Furious, he ordered a second strike. At 2:30 p.m., 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, escorted by Zeros, roared off Hiryu's deck. Once again, American radar detected them, and Wildcats clawed into their formation. Several Kates were shot down, but enough pressed the attack. At 2:42 p.m., Yorktown's gunners watched in horror as the torpedo planes bore in low, skimming the waves. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side in quick succession. The ship lurched violently, power failed, and she began listing heavily. Within minutes, all boilers shut down. Captain Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. Men slid down ropes into the oily sea. Lifeboats splashed overboard, and destroyers closed in to rescue survivors. Yorktown, which had fought so gallantly at Coral Sea only weeks before, now lay crippled and adrift. By late afternoon, Yorktown appeared finished. Yamaguchi believed his counterblow had evened the scales. But unseen to him, another American strike force was already on its way, closing in on Hiryu itself. The final carrier duel of Midway was about to begin. As the sun dropped lower on June 4, 1942, the Pacific waters boiled with fire, wreckage, and smoke. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were already gutted infernos. Hiryu, the last carrier afloat, had dealt a crushing counterblow to USS Yorktown, leaving her crippled and abandoned. Admiral Yamaguchi still clung to hope, believing he had damaged 2 American carriers and that perhaps victory was still within reach. He did not know the truth. Yorktown had been mistaken as a second ship, and the Americans still had Enterprise and Hornet fully operational. At 3:30 p.m., American scouts sighted Hiryu. The carrier steamed desperately, launching what remained of her patrol aircraft, unaware that U.S. dive bombers were already closing in. From Enterprise, squadrons VB-3, VB-6, and VS-6 gathered, joined by planes from Hornet's air group. Nearly 25 SBD Dauntless dive bombers clawed for altitude, banking into attack formation. Their mission: eliminate the final threat. At 4:15 p.m. they struck. From the sky, the Dauntlesses plummeted like hawks, canopies rattling, and dive brakes shrieking. Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened up furiously, tracers stitching the heavens, but the bombers did not falter. Lieutenant Dick Best, who had already planted the fatal bomb on Akagi, once again led his section into the dive. Bomb after bomb smashed into Hiryu's flight deck. At least 4 direct hits tore through her wooden planking and steel supports. Explosions erupted in her hangars, where armed aircraft and fuel lines became fireballs. Flames consumed the ship within minutes. Hiryu slowed, shuddering as smoke belched skyward. Yet Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon her. He gathered his officers, declaring they would share the ship's fate. As the crew evacuated into the sea, Yamaguchi remained aboard with Captain Tomei Okaku. Witnesses later recalled the admiral standing calmly, a white naval cap on his head, as flames closed in around him. Hiryu burned through the night, her fiery silhouette casting a red glow across the waves. Meanwhile, Yorktown, though abandoned, refused to sink. She floated stubbornly for nearly 24 hours, battered but defiant, until June 6th, when a Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped through the American screen and fired torpedoes. One struck the destroyer USS Hammond, breaking her in two. Others slammed into Yorktown. This time, the carrier rolled slowly, finally capsizing and sinking beneath the waves. By June 7th, the battle was over. Japan had lost 4 of its 6 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with over 250 aircraft and more than 3,000 men, including many of its most experienced pilots. The United States had lost Yorktown and 307 men. The scales of the Pacific War had shifted irreversibly. Midway was more than a victory. It was a turning point. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had struck first, seizing initiative. At Coral Sea, the Americans had fought to a draw. But at Midway, in a matter of hours, U.S. naval aviation had shattered the core of Japan's carrier force. From this point on, Japan would fight on the defensive, while the United States seized the momentum that would ultimately carry it across the Pacific. In the end, the Battle of Midway was decided not only by courage and sacrifice, but also by timing, luck, and the determination of men who refused to give up, even when all seemed lost. It was the day when the tide of World War II turned.